A little, determined puppy wandered onto a busy town square one winter morning, barking at people passing by and pulling at pant legs. But its goal was much higher than finding food or a place to call home when a good-hearted young guy. When he eventually followed the puppy, he came upon a tragic incident that would permanently alter his life. What might have inspired such courage in this small creature? And the morning was clear with a light fog circling the residents of Silverwood, a charming town surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills, were farmers starting their day, children hurrying to school, and store owners setting up their displays. Amidst the lively activity, unloading products at the busy market square, a golden-furred puppy with a matted coat rushed through the crowd, its paws hardly making a sound on the cobblestones. Its black eyes raced furiously over the unfamiliar faces of the town's people while covered in mud. Despite its messy look, the puppy exuded resolve and gave everyone who approached it a loud bark. Most people ignored it as if it were attempting to communicate, dismissing it as just another stray, but the puppy didn't give. Standing close by was a young man named Adrian, a university student on break. While enjoying his coffee in the morning sun at a cafe, he heard the puppy barking and squeezing through the crowd. Its tiny body shook adamantly, not from the cold, but rather from curiosity and impatience. Adrian knelt down and yelled, "Hey, little one, are you lost?" The dog instantly met Adrian's eyes. Adrian chuckled and growled once more, louder this time, before yanking at his pant leg. He gently tore off a piece of his croissant and held it out, figuring the dog was hungry, but the puppy ignored it completely instead, barking once more and pulling more forcefully while looking back at the edge of the square, seemingly encouraging him to pursue Adrian. As his interest grew, he stood up, saying, "What's up, buddy? You want me to go with you?" and let the dog guide him. It ran ahead, hesitating. Adrian departed the square with his coffee, seemingly losing the ability to follow the crowd every few meters. The dog, who had been left on a bench, guided him down a tiny, curving route that turned toward the woods. Adrian paused for the rustle of leaves and distant bird sounds have now taken the place of the town's happy sounds. However, he couldn't get rid of the puppy's infectious anxiousness and the sense that something significant was waiting for him at the happy buzz of the town faded as Adrian followed the puppy farther into the woods at the end of this bizarre journey. The narrow path behind him was overgrown, with leaves crunching beneath the puppy and roots creeping across the ground. Continued to look behind it, wagging its tail a little as though to make sure he was still. Even though the air got colder and the trees seemed more massive with each step, he seemed to be encouraged to keep going by following each bark. The young man wondered, "What are you trying to show me?" and what had prompted the small dog to approach him. He mumbled as he crossed a fallen branch, but despite his interest, he felt. The farther they traveled, the less familiar the woodland felt, and the more uneasiness crept in. Adrian had grown up in Silverwood and was familiar with its surrounding areas, but he had never seen this trail before, either buried or forgotten. The puppy eventually halted at a clearing, panting heavily but refusing to stop, possibly because it had gone unseen for years. As it gazed carefully at a piece of underbrush, Adrian trod on. It barked once more, its tiny body quivering. He gasped as he looked closer, sweeping back the bushes and brambles. A larger dog was lying on the ground, its body partially obscured by leaves, its golden fur stained with muck. Evident that she had been there for a while. Her left hind leg was twisted, her eyes were half closed, and her breathing was faint. Surrounding her at an odd angle, Adrian observed the agonizing tangles of. Despite her state, she managed to lift the barbed vines and thorns that were ripping into her skin. "Oh no," Adrian muttered, her head trembling at the sight of Adrian with her puppy. With a heavy heart, he crouched next to the injured dog, being cautious not to frighten her. The dog, obviously upset, nuzzled and moaned against its mother. "Hey there, girl," softly saying, "It's okay. I'll help you." Adrian rapidly evaluated the circumstance. The dog was weak and dehydrated, and her wounds were probably the result of a last-ditch effort to escape. Adrian recognized that the dense, tangled plants and prickly vines would require a lot of work to get rid of it without hurting anyone more. He muttered a groan and wished he had brought his phone. He glanced at the face of the puppy, which was now its mother, and he needed aid. He said, "You did well, little one," while softly scratching the CL. "But I can't do this by myself." Without hesitation, Adrian. As he stood and looked around, he noticed a small, run-down shack in the distance. It was a wooden building. Previously, he told the dog to stay here and keep her company because there might have been tools inside that could aid. "I'll be right." Despite being aged and covered in moss, the shed was agitated, and Adrian discovered it. He noticed a coil of rope and a pair of rusted shears among a collection of outdated gardening equipment and supplies. Weren't perfect, but they would have to make do. He also noticed a dusty, sealed bottle of water on a shelf. Despite the faded label, it appeared clean enough to use, so I hurried back to the clearing. Adrian got to work, carefully cutting away the prickly vines with the shears. Despite the task's difficulty, the injured dog's hands remained steady, but periodically he flinched and gave out faint whimpers. But Adrian reassured her with each snip of the shears, saying, "It's okay, girl, you're going to." Once the vines were taken down, Adrian gently said, "Just hang in there." Used the sleeve of his jacket to wipe the dog's wounds with water and pat them dry, as the puppy observed carefully as if recognizing the significance of each move. Adrian completed making a temporary splint for her leg using a strong stick and the rope he had discovered. The dog's breathing started to stabilize. With a glimmer of appreciation in his eyes, Adrian grinned, happy that his efforts. He stroked her head and remarked, "You're a tough one, aren't you?" as if to make a difference. "Now we simply need to get you." Adrian noticed how light the puppy was and carefully lifted her somewhere safe. Her once strong body had become fragile due to hunger. The puppy walked next to him, its tail wagging. Adrian knew it wouldn't be simple to carry the injured dog through the town as they started the trek back. His arms hurt after just a few minutes due to the difficult, uneven forest terrain, but he persisted because, with the intention of providing her with the care she needed, Adrian walked slowly through the woodland, carrying although the injured puppy in his arms weighed little. The exertion of negotiating difficult terrain while making sure she was safe was beginning to take its toll. The dog faithfully followed after him, occasionally dashing forward before. As they approached the forest's edge and heard the sounds of the town, they circled back as though to reassure Adrian to keep going. The distant voices, the hum of traffic, and the odd bark of a neighborhood dog started to come through the trees. Adrian breathed a sigh of relief as they approached the nearby veterinarian facility. The dog shifted slightly in his arms, her eyes flicking open for a moment as they headed into the town square. Adrian said in a murmur, "Hang in there, girl," just before closing once more. As if reflecting his conviction, the puppy barked quietly when they were almost there. When Adrian finally came out of the trees, his appearance attracted notice right once. A few people stopped in their tracks, their expressions displaying a mixture of interest and worry. One elderly woman came up to them. She inquired, her voice shaking, "Young man, is that dog okay?" Adrian said, clutching her pocketbook, "I'm taking the dog to the woods, where I discovered her stranded after shifting her in his arms." The veterinarian nodded, and her eyes softened. "Bless you, poor thing. It appears that she has experienced a lot." Adrian gave her a brief smile as she looked down at the puppy that was waving its tail at her. "You're doing well, sweetie. Thank you." And he kept moving forward with steady focus. The streets of Silverwood were familiar, but the trip felt longer than normal on the way to the clinic. His arms hurt, and beads of sweat ran down his forehead, but he wouldn't slow down. As Adrian pushed the clinic door open with his shoulder, the bell above it jingled. The reception area was. The air was clear and bright, with a hint of antiseptic odor coming from a young woman. The receptionist questioned, standing up as Scrubs looked up from her desk, her eyes widening at what she saw. Was she hurt? Adrian stated in a rapid, frantic voice that she was hurt and weak, and this small. The receptionist called as one of them took me to her and motioned at the puppy standing at his feet, nervously waving its tail. Into the rear, and a little later, Dr. Evelyn Harper, a veterinarian, a woman in her mid-40s with gentle eyes and a composed demeanor, came up. Pointing for Adrian to follow her, she added, "Let's get her to an exam room." Adrian placed the dog gently on the exam table. Dr. Harper's hands started moving as soon as she started her assessment. You did a fantastic job supporting her leg deftly while she looked for any further injuries. She glanced at Adrian. Adrian described the circumstances, describing how the puppy had guided him to the wounded dog. Where did you discover her? Dr. Harper listened carefully to her solemn expression in the forest. Fortunately, you brought her in. She is extremely starved and dehydrated, but her injuries are manageable, going to require time and attention to heal. The puppy stood on its hind legs and whimpered gently as it peered over the edge of the. Adrian grinned at the table in spite of the tense atmosphere. It appears that someone is concerned about their mother. Dr. Harper laughed. A faithful child, isn't he? With the proper attention, they'll both be fine. She turned to the receptionist. As the clinic staff prepares the x-ray machine and starts in 4 for fluids, I want to be sure there isn't any inside harm. Adrian moved effectively, retreated to give them room to operate, and observed as the dog was cautiously connected to the 4. Her breathing stabilized, and the puppy refused to be separated, lie down close to the table, and never leave its mother's watchful gaze. Dr. Harper came up to Adrian once more and stated, "You've done more than most people would have in your situation." Adrian shrugged and felt a little uncomfortable as someone carried an injured dog through the woods to obtain treatment. I was too embarrassed to simply leave her there, and the small man he pointed at. Dr. Harper grinned warmly. "You've saved me, as the puppy wouldn't have allowed me to. 2 lives today is something to be proud of." As the clinic's personnel cared for Adrian's injured dog, Vigilant remained against the wall, watching the action play out. Near its mother's side, Dr. Harper worked diligently and with unflinching focus. Adrienne's mind wandered as she studied the x-rays on a nearby monitor, considering the odd conditions that had led him to this forest, the surprising discovery, and it felt unreal for the determined puppy, and his thoughts were cut off as Dr. Harper walked over to him, her face solemn, yet intrigued Adrian. He tightened his forehead and furrowed it as she started to carry a clipboard. "This case is strange. Do you mean that?" Dr. Harper pointed to the x-rays, even though her wounds were consistent with being confined, and I also discovered evidence of past abuse on her body. Adrienne's stomach dropped due to fractures that have not healed properly. "Do you imply that she has experienced pain in the past, Dr. Harper?" "Agreed. And these wounds imply that she may have been mistreated or participated in something risky. In addition, she hesitated before I looked for a microchip in the PPS on her clipboard. She has one, but the address is out of state, even if it is registered to a name." When Adrienne became curious about who she belonged to, Dr. Harper gave him a sheet, a paper, with Elena Fisher's name and an address in a nearby state printed at the top. "I'll get in touch with the woman who reported her dog stolen 2 months ago to confirm, but this could help to explain how the..." Adrienne's thoughts were racing. If the dog had come from out of state, how had she arrived in Silverwood? What about the puppy? Did she own it, or did it just? The questions weighed heavy as Dr. Harper moved aside to find her in the wilderness and take her under its wing. Adrian looked at the puppy sitting next to him as he made the call. Dr. Harper reappeared minutes later, his wide eyes glancing up as if sensing his uneasiness. "When I got to Eleanor Fisher, her face was unreadable, and she verified the dog's. Her name is Daisy Eleanor, and since she vanished, people have been looking for her. Her description and microchip number. About 100 miles away." Adrian experienced a pang while camping by a river, of relief at the possibility of Daisy's reunion with her owner, but Dr. Harper's face conveyed to him that there was. She added that Daisy was her late husband's military dog when he asked her what else she had to say about the story. Daisy, his friend, and the soldier who died last year shared a bond that she had never witnessed before. Adrian nodded slowly, realizing the seriousness of the issue. "But Daisy has been a crushing blow to her." Dr. Harper's eyes softened when she told her about the puppy, and she was unable to explain it because she didn't think Daisy might have. This matter is further complicated by the fact that she may have had puppies, or even whether this one is hers. Adrian felt a wave of grief upon learning that Daisy had suffered so much loss, harm, and it was devastating and motivating to be separated just to live and possibly become a mother. What comes next? Despite Daisy's whirlwind of ideas, Adrian asked in a steady voice, "Here to recuperate and set up Eleanor's arrival as soon as possible. Dr. Harper stated that we will need to examine the puppy." Adrian looked down at their connection to be sure it was hers, but he's not going to leave her side anytime soon. Daisy sank into the spot, and the little dog yawned and snuggled up at his feet. "I don't think he's going anywhere." Under the clinic's care, Adrian started to experience momentary alleviation, but the little puppy by her side and the mystery surrounding her voyage pestered him about how a dog was connected to a veteran's legacy, ended up hurt and by himself in a jungle. Was the puppy a stranger? Did Adrian have a closer connection to Daisy's story the following morning? Or did he stray? Went back to the clinic to see how Daisy and the puppy were doing. Dr. Harper greeted him with a weary smile, saying that although Daisy is stable, theirs. She started pointing him in the direction of the examination room, where Daisy was lying on a padded bed. The dog lay curled next to her, his tiny body rising, his limb now properly splinted. Dr. Harper knelt down and ran her hand along, falling in time with hers. "I discovered a second tag concealed on Daisy's back last night while tending to her wounds. It is inscribed beneath her collar with Adrienne's eyes and a number that resembles a military emblem. Expanded, you believe it has to do with her former owner?" Dr. Harper nodded. "Perhaps. I have contacted a local veterans organization to ask if they can provide the unit code or something similar. Assist in identifying it." Adrian was crouching next to Daisy, softly caressing her head. "Been through a lot. Therefore will be worthwhile if this results in answers." While they were conversing, the clinic doorbell rang, and a staff member announced to Dr. Harper that someone was inquiring about. Adrian, the dog, looked at Dr. Harper with a mixture of caution and interest. As they passed each other, they made their way to the front desk, where a man in his late 50s stood with a worn face framed between. He had a gray beard and a faded blazer with patches sewed on it, which suggested that he had been in the military. "Can I help?" Dr. Harper questioned in a courteous but cautious tone, and the man nodded. "My name is Daniel, and I work." "You brought up a dog wearing a military tag with the neighborhood veterans club," and Dr. Harper pointed to the examination room. "She was hurt in the wilderness, but she's getting better. Do you recognize this?" She gave him a picture of. Daniel carefully examined the tag and insignia before his face changed. "This comes from a K9 team that served abroad approximately 10 years ago. The dogs were trained for search and rescue missions." Adrienne's interest was piqued by missions and bomb detection. "You're implying Daisy might have been a service?" Daniel, the dog, nodded that it's probably true, and if so, her training could describe how she recovered from her injuries and left her location. "These canines are incredibly strong, Dr. Do you know how we could verify her past?" Harper asked. Daniel paused. "There is a database, but only handlers and specific military personnel can access it, so it's difficult. Contact a few people to see what I can find." Adrian couldn't help but be impressed by Daisy if she was actually a former service dog, and her tale was even more remarkable than he had anticipated. As Daniel made calls and informed Dr. Harper Adrian of developments and brought the dog back to the examination room. Alerted to his arrival, jumping over with a waving tail, Adrian squatted to pet him. Feeling a stronger bond with the small dog, Adrian whispered, "You've gone through a lot too, don't you?" Adrian spent time with a brave little man. An idea of Daisy's past started to take shape in his mind as he was with her and the puppy. Could be discovered. It could provide Elena, her owner, with closure and help explain how she got into the wilderness. But it also prompted still another query. What if Daisy was a hero with a tale to tell in addition to being a survivor? When Adrian arrived at the clinic early the next day, he was welcomed by a serene, almost tranquil atmosphere. Daisy was. The puppy was sprawled next to her while she rested and let her wounds to gradually heal. Adrian saw a change in Daisy's attitude. Her eyes appeared fatigued, yet more trusting. She seemed to sense the security and concern around her. Daniel came in soon after bringing a. He glanced urgently at Adrian and Dr. Harper while holding an old photograph and a battered notebook. "I have some news," he said. "I reached out to an old handler from the unit Daisy might be a part of and started placing the notebook on the counter. Verified that the tag belongs to a dog named Stella. If this is her, she was adopted 5 years ago after retiring from active duty." Stella, Eleanor's real name, was caught in the breath of Adrian. her handler. Daniel acknowledged that while handlers frequently rename retiring canines to aid in their transition to civilian life, military records maintain. Eleanor, Stella's original name, was a testament to her loyalty, bravery, and intelligence. Adrian experienced a pang of shame when Elena died. Discovered her message stating that she had given her nephew Stella or Daisy, but that something had gone awry, and Daniel's face slumped. If the dog got hurt and abandoned in the forest, that's terrible. Someone must have let her down or betrayed her confidence. Elena put Dr. Harper in there, and he ever asked a useful question. What do we do now that Stella needs time to heal? Yet this puppy makes everything more difficult. If Stella was left behind, how did? Adrian looked at the joyful puppy that had joined her story. Curiosity surged. What if the puppy isn't just a random one? Perhaps he's a contributing factor in Stella's. There's more to this, Daniel. He ended up out there as a buddy and guardian. Leaning on the counter, he seemed thoughtful. If he left, we need to find Elena's nephew. Stella, we should hold him responsible, but we also owe it to you if there is more to the story. Adrian felt conflicted over Stella's revelation of the truth. What if the nephew hadn't intended to leave her? Dr. Harper added, it's possible, but if you try to find her, what happened? If someone genuinely cared for Stella, wouldn't they have called the police or reported her missing? The three discussed the options. The doorbell rang, and a woman with a pale, nervous face came into the clinic with A. Adrian was given a poster with Stella's picture and the words, "Missing Dog Reward," came forward and asked if I might be of assistance. The woman identified herself as Lydia, and I'm. Following the death of her nephew Jared, Eleanor's neighbor briefly moved in to settle her estate. I made an effort to assist him get used to it, but one day he said Stella fled, and although he appeared heartbroken, I couldn't get rid of the impression that there was more to the tale. Did he ever locate Adrian? Her heart was racing. Lydia shook her head, although I doubt it. He said he couldn't bear to stay at Elena's house any longer when he departed a few months ago, but I just came across this flyer and decided to give it another go. Daniel displayed the picture, showing that this dog is Stella. Lydia's relief upon recovery was evident. Thank God. I knew she deserved better. Tell me she's okay, please. Dr. Harper assured her that she was recovering, but it will. Slow down. Do you know where Jared could be? Lydia paused, but he said he was going to. A remote cabin in the woods that Eleanor used to take him to when he was younger. Adrian might be there. We track him down if he has answers because Stella needs to know the truth. Adrian, Daniel, and Lydia. Lydia brought a map, and when they met in the clinic's little break room, she traced a winding trail with her finger. Elena used to take Jared to this isolated cottage when he was a little boy, Lydia, which is where he may be staying. She used to comment, "It's peaceful, surrounded by trees and a small creek." After her retirement, Adrian looked at the map to see if Jared was there. It was a haven for her and Stella. Losing Stella and Eleanor may have been too much for Daniel, who has been battling feelings of loss and remorse. If he left Stella to fend for herself, is he hiding his arms? Jared loved Elena, but he might not want to deal with the fallout. Lydia interrupted her, her voice shaking. I want to think that he also cared for Stella, but I agree that if he is present, we need to find out what transpired since Stella deserves that much. Dr. Harper came into the room with a clipboard. Stella is capable of making a quick trip, but only if she has been handled. Since Adrian is still too little to go, the puppy should remain here. She might be able to identify the location if she heads toward the recovery room where Stella slept. It served as her haven and could aid in her emotional recovery. Daniel brought up it's dangerous to take Stella's eyebrows. What if Jared reacts negatively? Even worse, what if we'll know we tried when Adrian's determination solidifies, but Stella didn't give up, and I won't either. The following morning, Adrian put Stella in his vehicle. Lydia sat in the passenger seat with the map, her movements still cautious but more assured, while Daniel. The journey to the cabin became more perilous as the paved roads gave way, and he was followed in his truck carrying supplies. As they got closer to the cabin, Adrian saw potholes in the dirt pathways. Stella's nose twitches and her ears perk up as he spoke. I remember this place. When the cabin appeared, his heart began to swell with anticipation. It was both picturesque and the old wood building, with its windows reflecting the morning light, appeared eerily against a backdrop of tall trees. There was someone inside, as shown by the sun's smoke curving languidly from the chimney. Daniel cautiously stepped out of his truck after parking it behind Adrienne's vehicle. Now that he's hammering solidly on the door, let's hope he's willing to chat. Adrienne led Stella up the creaking porch steps. There was a brief pause before the door cracked wide to show a haggard, untidy man. His gaze flickered between Adrienne and Stella before expanding in. Adrienne, is that her? Stella Jared's voice shook, and he gripped the doorframe for support. Forcefully stated that we need to know what happened to her and why you left her. As he opened the door further, Jared's face twisted in shame. Come in, he said, explaining that the cabin was small but clean, with a little wood smoke odor permeating the air. Jared gestured for them to sit while he stood. I loved Stella, he said, moving uneasily, his voice faltering as Eleanor died. I believed I could care for her, but Stella's anguish was too much for me. Reminded me of all the things I had lost. I didn't intentionally leave her one day. I looked for weeks, but I was unable to locate her once she got away, and Adrienne was let down. Felt a wave of annoyance. Why didn't you inform someone that she was missing? Jared looked down in embarrassment. Written on his face, I didn't want to acknowledge that I had let Elena down since I believed I didn't deserve it if I couldn't locate Stella. Continue looking. I assumed she would return, as she always did. Lydia said. She was hurt and by herself until Adrienne raised her voice, forceful but steady. If Jared hadn't discovered her, she would not have lived. I don't deserve it. Jared slumped into a chair. Forgiveness, but my affection for Stella, who had been secretly lying by. Adrienne's feet abruptly rose and moved toward Jared. Her motions were hesitant but deliberate, and Jared's gaze filled with tears, and he whispered, his voice shaking even after Stella pressed his hand with her nose, remembering me. Adrienne felt a knot in his throat for what she remembered. Dogs don't hold, resents Jared, but if you're prepared to take care of them, they definitely deserve respect and care. Accountability. There's an opportunity to put things right. The following morning, Adrienne got Stella into his vehicle and drove away. Lydia sat in the passenger seat, still wary but more assured, gripping the map. Daniel followed in his truck carrying supplies, and the journey to the cabin became incredibly dangerous. As they got closer to the cabin, Adrienne saw Stella's ears perk up as the paved roads gave place to pothole-filled dirt trails. He whispered softly, his heart swelled. This place reminds me of you, as her nose twitched. With optimism, the cabin appeared, and it was both idyllic and unsettling. Against a backdrop of tall trees, an aged wood building stood, its windows reflecting the smoke from the morning sun, curled languidly from the chimney, indicating that Daniel had a person inside. Parked his truck behind Adrienne's vehicle, then carefully stepped out. All right, let's. I'm hoping he's open to speaking with Adrienne led Stella, as she groans loudly at the door from the creaking porch steps. There was a pause, and then the door cracked open to show a thin, unkempt man. Stella Jared's voice shattered his hand, and his eyes flitted between Adrienne and Stella before widening with recognition. Firmly onto the door frame for support, Adrienne murmured, Is that her? Jared's face was twisted. We need to know what happened to her and why you left her. He opened the door further and said, Come in. I'll explain. Inside the cabin, with a sense of shame, was clean but sparse, and there was a slight wood smoke odor in the air. Jared. I adored Stella, he said, gesturing for them to sit while he stood pacing uneasily. I was shaky when Eleanor died, but I believed I could take care of her. Stella reminded me of everything I had lost, and the pain was overwhelming. Didn't intentionally leave her behind. One day, she ran away, and I was unable to locate her. Adrienne was furious that I hadn't found him after weeks of searching. Why didn't you inform someone that she was missing? Jared glanced down in shame. Written on his face, I didn't want to acknowledge that I had let Elena down since I believed I didn't deserve it if I couldn't locate Stella. Continue looking. I assumed she would return, as she always did. Lydia said. She was hurt and by herself until Adrienne raised her voice, forceful but steady. If Jared hadn't discovered her, she would not have lived. I don't deserve it. Jared slumped into a chair. Forgiveness, but my affection for Stella, who had been secretly lying by. Adrienne's feet sprung up and came toward Jared. Her movements were hesitant but deliberate, and Jared's gaze filled with tears, and he whispered, his voice shaking even after Stella pressed his hand with her nose, "Remembering me." Adrienne felt a knot in his throat from what she remembered. Dogs don't hold. Resents Jared, but if you're prepared to take care of them, they definitely deserve respect and care. Responsibility. Daniel stepped in as the group debated a plan for Stella's care, giving CH the opportunity to put things right. The fresh forest air welcomed him as he went outdoors to get provisions from his truck. However, something didn't feel right, so his years of experienced instincts as a park ranger took over. He looked over the Adrienne, Daniel yelled, his eyes narrowing at something close to the forest line, and he stepped back into the cabin. "We might have company." Adrienne stood with his face furrowed. "What do you think?" Daniel gestured toward the window, and I noticed movement there. It might have been a coyote or something else, but either way, we should. Look at that, Jared. Normally, coyotes wouldn't approach the cabin this closely unless something drew them in. After exchanging glances and a silent understanding, Adrienne and Daniel grabbed a flashlight and a stout. Adrienne nodded and said, "Let's go outside." The woodland was unnaturally quiet. Dan guided the route with his flashlight piercing the darkness, the only sounds coming from the crunch of leaves beneath his feet. They didn't need to search far from the property's boundary because Adrienne kept his senses sharp and attentive. Discovered that a ripped dog food bag strewn close to the tree tracks had caught the attention of wildlife. Around the region, Adrienne was too big to be a coyote, but not quite human. Examining the prints from a crouch, these don't appear to be wild animals. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched. Most likely the same individual who abandoned the food to draw coyotes. They wanted Stella to be vulnerable, so Adrienne held on to the walking stick, increasing his hold as we had to return to the cabin. Now that they were back inside, Adrienne and Daniel rushed through the door as Jared and Lydia were caring for Stella. It was evident that there was a problem, and Adrienne swiftly described what they had discovered. Jared's face darkened. This cabin was meant to be a safe place, but someone has been here and they are not friendly. Haven, if Stella is being targeted, even Lydia's voice might not be enough to deter them. Adrienne shook his head, wondering why someone would wish to harm Stella, who is only a dog. If someone believes she's valuable, perhaps as a rare breed, or because of her relationship to. Jared remained resolute despite the possibility that they would view her as a prize. "It is my fault for leaving her without protection, but I refuse to allow anyone to take her." Adrienne put a comforting hand on Jared's shoulder and said, "We'll guard her together, but we need to be clever." Jared and Lydia were caring for Stella back inside when Adrienne and Daniel rushed in. "We have an issue," Adrienne remarked rapidly, and their urgency was evident. Jared's face darkened as they discovered that someone had visited and was not pleasant. This cabin was supposed to be a safe haven. If someone is after Stella, they might not stop because of her Lydia's hesitant speech. Adrienne shook his head, saying that if somebody wants to harm Stella, she's only a dog. Then that, if someone believes she's valuable, perhaps because she's a rare breed or because of her relationship to Eleanor, they might see. Jared remained steadfast in his resolve to ensure that we're not going to let anyone to take her. "I'm sorry for not protecting her, but I won't allow it to happen again." Adrienne placed a comforting hand on Jared's shoulder. "We'll work together to keep her safe, but we must be considerate of the strain in." As Jared and Adrienne got ready to face whatever was hiding outside, the cabin felt almost oppressive. Daniel remained near the glass, his keen eyes searching the darkened area for any movement Lydia could be making. Stella remained composed despite her own hands shaking by whispering comforting words. Adrienne gestured fearfully to Jared, who was clutching the walking stick in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "We move slowly, stay together, and avoid making abrupt movements around anyone." Jared nodded, swallowing hard as they used terror to manipulate us. Glanced in Stella's direction, who raised her head a little as though she could sense the discomfort. "Let's do this," he continued, his voice growing steadier. Then he sensed the chilly night air strike them with the subtle rustle of leaves as they stepped onto the porch. With the sporadic stream of branches, the flashlight beam pierced the darkness, exposing only shadows and Adrian tightened his hold on the walking stick as the forest's outlines appeared, and he said, "Stay alert." The sound of gravel crunching beneath them caught their attention, and Jared gestured toward the dim. Adrian lifted the outline of a figure crouching close to the dog food that was all over the place. Flashlight, the illumination striking a man in tattered clothing with a cowl covering part of his face. "Who are you and why are you here?" Adrian called out, his voice forceful. The man froze, his hands lingering close to the ground, and he slowly stood up. His meticulous motions and the flashlight's illumination of his face revealed that he was familiar with hard times, was thin, and there was a mixture of defiance and desperation in his eyes. "I don't want." The man's voice was gruff, but I didn't wish to frighten anyone. "Any trouble?" With a stern tone, Jared moved forward. Then, "Why were you skulking around my property? What do you want, man?" Paused to look toward the cabin before focusing on Jared. I had heard about the dog, and he acknowledged that it was the one that. Adrian's eyes furrowed as he said, "You know, a dog like that, people think she's worth something." "Worth something? You intend to sell her?" The man shrugged, his shoulders drooping beneath an unseen burden. "I'm not sure. I just wanted to confirm that some people believe she is valuable. You think she's a commodity, but I promise you that I wasn't going to harm her." Jared's fists are clenched at his sides. "Something to sell or trade. She's a member of my family." The man made a plating gesture with his hands, saying, "Look, I understand. Even though I made a mistake by coming here, some folks won't leave." The man's remarks lingered in the atmosphere, a terrifying reminder that Adrian's problems might only be getting started. Looked at Jared, his thoughts racing, thinking that if news of Stella had gotten out, there would soon be more. "Why did you come by yourself?" Adrian strained his tone. "Were there opportunists or worse?" Fern, the man, shook his head emphatically. "No, I swear. Are you scouting for someone?" "I arrive alone, but I heard a group discussing going in this direction and saying something about claiming what was there." "What do you mean that Stella doesn't belong to them?" Jared's stomach wrenched. The man paused, his eyes falling to the ground. "Although I believe they meant. They believe she may have been trained for something valuable." Adrienne's jaw, due of her relationship with Eleanor. "Stella is a remarkable dog, and Eleanor was a former dog trainer. However, I'm telling you, that doesn't give anyone the right to target her." The man retreated a step in his motions. "Take it or leave it. I know, but I would be prepared for trouble if I were you." As he approached the man, Jared's tone sharpened. "If you're lying, you best hope you're telling the truth." Adrian put a hand on Jared's shoulder and interrupted him, saying, "We're not going to lead those people here. Threats are a waste of time. Let's concentrate on protecting Stella." The man nodded and hurried away into the shadows. He whispered, "I won't bother you again," and vanished into the forest. Once they were back inside the cabin, the gang reunited, with the man's threat pressing down on them. Daniel strengthened the windows and secured the doors while Adrian and Lydia talked about their next course of action. Adrian stated in a firm tone, "We can't stay here." It's true what he said. This place is no longer safe. Jared's face was grim, but where would we go? Stella's still. Lydia touched his arm while she was recuperating and in need of support. "We'll sort it out. Keeping her secure is the most crucial thing." Daniel came back from securing the. "Nevertheless, we must be prepared if they arrive. We will hold our ground for the time being, but if things get out of control, we must leave." Adrian nodded in agreement. "So let's concentrate on safeguarding Stella and creating." The mood inside the cabin grew thicker as the night went on, making sure we're ready for anything. Each creak of every rustle of the wind outside on the wooden floor felt like a prelude to something. Jared, who was much more menacing, sat next to Stella and caressed her fur and large. Adrian's resolve was only strengthened when her beautiful eyes glanced up at him and softly expressed her faith. Window using binoculars he had borrowed from the cabin storage to survey the forest line. There was no movement yet, so he mumbled his tense but low voice, "But it doesn't mean we're safe." Lydia went around the cabin, setting up a rudimentary. "Bring water, first aid kits, and some food cans in case we need them." She looked at Jared and added, "We need to be ready to make a swift departure." "But we." Jared's jaw tightened. "I can't leave Stella behind. She's too vulnerable. Never abandon her. No matter what, we remain united." While the group worked in silence, Stella gave a piercing bark that broke. A deep growl rumbled in her throat as she stood up in the tense silence. Her ears perked up and her eyes focused on the front entrance. Jared instantly knelt next to her, his heart racing. "What is it, girl?" muttered. But her response gave him all the information he needed to know that someone or something was coming. Daniel moved. As soon as possible, put out the lamps, leaving the cabin completely dark. He told them to keep quiet since we didn't want to make things easier for them if they were out there. Adrian gestured for Jared to remain with Stella as he and Daniel took up positions close to the windows As the moonlight began to trickle in, they noticed two dim shadows moving just past the tree line. Adrian, "They're here," verified that his hardly discernible voice resembles at least 3 of Jared's. "What do they want with her, Adrian?" Her hands are balled into fists. Turn to face him, his face solemn. "Not to them. She represents. They don't care about her as a living human, despite their strength, loyalty, and possibly even value. We can't allow anyone to approach her because of this." The first knock was loud and purposeful, breaking the "We can tell you're there" because of the fragile silence. A deep voice shouted out, with a commanding presence that made Jared shudder. "Let's make this simple. Hand over the dog and head out." Adrian moved cautiously, approached the door. "But you were the only one there. What makes you believe you have the authority to insist that he shout back, his tone to calm the man down?" Darkly laughed outside. "We're not here to argue. You have something we want." Lydia whispered to Jared. "Either you turn it over or things get ugly. What should we do?" Jared shook his head, saying, "We're not giving her up. Not now, not ever the time. We can't resist them because we're outnumbered. This is your last chance." The voice. The second knock was more difficult, practically a bang. Adrian turned to face the others, his eyes meeting, warning that we don't have all night. Jared firmly said, "Get Stella out of here. There's a back way through the woods. I'll divert their attention." "No way." Daniel went up and objected. "I'm not leaving you here to face them alone. We can keep them at bay long enough for you to bring Stella to safety. So I'll stay too." Adrian nodded, despite the stress in his. His fearful attitude was nice, but you don't have to wait long once they. Jared took Stella in his arms, being careful not to agitate her, realizing that we're stalling and that things may quickly get out of hand. "Wounded," he assured her, "we'll find a safe place." His voice remained firm as he turned to. Lydia led the group after she had already put the pack over her shoulder. She moved quickly but silently as they slid into the night to the rear door. Adrian barely opened the front door to indicate that he wanted to speak. "Let's." The only light coming from the trees was dim and confusing, so he yelled out to the soldiers outside. Jared trailed closely after, his heart pounding as he made his way into the dim moonlight above. Uneven ground, Stella moaned quietly in his arms, perhaps sensing danger. Looking back at him, Lydia said, "There's an old hunting cabin up ahead. We can hide there until it's safe." Jared froze, his fingers tightening as a loud boom reverberated from the direction of the cabin they had just left. "Stella, what did he ask?" His voice was tinged with anxiety, and Lydia's expression was. They had begun to become pale, and Adrian and Daniel are running out of time. Jared turned his eyes before he could react, because the sound of heavy footfall behind them chilled his blood. When she couldn't find anything in the darkness, Stella started growling once more. Tensing in his arms, Lydia encouraged him to keep moving since we couldn't stop just now, but Jared's pulse quickened as he heard footsteps getting closer and realized they were being pursued. He said to Lydia, "Go to the cabin, and I'll hold you." Lydia shot back, but we stayed together as they pressed ahead at their own pace, accelerating even though they were feeling the effects of fatigue and worry when the hunting cabin eventually appeared. Jared felt a wave of relief wash over him, but as they got to the door, a man appeared from. The man drew a sinister grin that grew across his face as the shadows effectively blocked their route. Jared froze Stella, who was still held in his arms as the man's. Lydia moved in front of Jared out of reflex, raising her arms defensively as the shadow loomed over them. The man's face was partially hidden by the darkness, but his sly smile was clearly visible. "You offer to say," the man replied, "Chase," in a mocking tone, "but I always catch what I'm." Stella growled softly as Jared tightened his hold on her, saying, You're not taking her, he remarked in a firm voice, even though he was terrified. The man laughed and took a hesitant step forward. I'll give you credit for having courage, youngster. That's won't save you, Lydia thought, racing through her thoughts for a solution. You don't have to do this, she said. Try to convince him that because she's only a dog, why go to such lengths? The man's smile wavered a little and was replaced with a flash of rage that you believe this is related to. You have no idea what you're getting yourself in, and that much is worth more than you can think. Jared stomped on a puppy. What are you talking about? The man's eyes. His heart is racing, narrowed, and he moved closer. Let's just say that she's unique, and maybe I'll let you leave before Jared can, since someone is prepared to spend a lot of money to get her back. In response, Stella gave a piercing bark, shocking the man with the abrupt noise. Appeared to startle Jared into action, and he moved Stella into Lydia's embrace. Get her out of here, please. I won't abandon you, Lydia protested in a whisper. Jared shook his head, staring at the man. I'll divert his attention, but first. Stella's loud bark startled the man and seemed to startle Jared into action before he could react. He moved Stella into Lydia's embrace and pleaded with her to quickly remove herself from. Lydia objected. Here, I'm not leaving you. And Jared shook his head, staring at. I'll divert him, just go. The two fought, with Jared avoiding the man's first strike and delivering a last-ditch blow to his side, which didn't cause much harm but gave. Jared had a fleeting opportunity to seize a nearby branch, so he used all of his strength to swing it, catching the man by the shoulder end. The man roared, standing himself. But you're out of your power, sending him reeling back. Jared didn't reply. Instead, he concentrated on keeping the man busy. The adrenaline pumping through his veins was the only thing keeping him going during what seemed like an eternity of swing and block. Jared dodged the man's first swing and delivered a last-ditch punch to his side, but the blow wasn't enough. Significant damage, but it provided Jared with a fleeting opportunity to seize a nearby branch. He used all of his might to swing it, catching the man growled, "You have some fight in you," slapping him across the shoulder and sending him reeling back. You're out of your league, Jared, because he didn't answer his focus. Focusing only on keeping the man busy, the adrenaline pumping through his veins made every swing and block seem endless. Jared was losing steam, which was the only thing preventing him from returning to the trees. The man's strength was overwhelming, and Jared found it more difficult to stand upright with each strike, but he persisted. He was inspired to keep fighting when he remembered Stella's unshakable faith in him. As the man advanced for, another blow came, and both men froze as a sharp cry reverberated across the forest. A group of stray dogs appeared out of the shadows, their gaze racing toward the source of the sound, their eyes gleaming brightly. The man stepped back, whispering in the moonlight, and the pack surrounding them. There was a big scar dog in the middle of the bunch, growling low and menacingly. It moved forward and bared its teeth at the man with a dominant presence. Jared gaped in shock as the dog appeared and gnawed in his direction, seemingly appreciating his courage. The man swore. Clearly outnumbered, he said, "This isn't over," and backed away. He turned and raced into the night, the pack tearing at his heels until he vanished from view. You'll regret this. Jared fell to his knees, his body shaking from exertion, and the big dog came over to him, softening his gaze. Jared gave him a gentle prod as though to say, "You did well. Thank you." The pack lingered for a time before breaking, and I'm not sure how, but thank you. Jared took a deep breath and staggered toward the cabin, his legs hardly supporting him, as they retreated into the woods after doing their task. Lydia pushed open the door when he arrived, her face flooded with relief. She sobbed and dragged Jared inside. "Are you okay? What happened?" He fell into "I'm all right, but you wouldn't believe what just happened" chair, his breath is heavy. With a worried expression on her face, Lydia gave him a bottle of water. Stella walked over to Jared with her tail wagging, saying, "You need to rest now, later." With a feeble smile, he drew her into his lap and buried his face in her fur. As the first lights of morning streamed through the cabin windows, Jared, Lydia, and Stella sat, and he said that the girl was safe. For the first time in hours, they allowed themselves to breathe as the horrors of the night gave way to a sense of serenity. The morning light filtered through the hut wall's fissures, casting warm light as they realized they had conquered the impossibility. Though the night gave way to the day, there was still a sense of relief over Jared, Lydia, and Stella. Of uneasiness persisted as Jared sat by the window, looking up at the tree to see whether the guy who had tormented him was there. Lydia put a loving touch on his shoulder during the night and murmured, "You need rest, as you have been awake all night." Night. Jared shook his head and tightened his hold on the chair, making it difficult for him to unwind. He stated that this was not yet over. What if he returns? What if he growls softly? Stella cut him off, pinning the dog's ears back and making her body rigid. Jared and Lydia exchanged a sniff as she hobbled to the door, pressing her nose against the base gap. Before any of them could respond, they exchanged anxious looks as they heard footfall crunching on the gravel outside Jared. As he got closer to the door, his heart thumping, he yanked it and signaled Lydia to wait behind him. Open, exposing the dog's scars from the previous night, which stood there serene, and the dog moved forward and nudged a bundle while maintaining a resolute stare at Jared. Jared crouched down to examine it closely as it was brought in its teeth onto the porch. Inside was a ragged jacket. The dog snarled softly, and he instantly recognized it as belonging to the man who had attacked them. Lydia's voice was scarcely audible above a whisper as she urged Jared to follow her toward the woodland. His jaw is down, revealing to us where he traveled with nothing but with resoluteness. Jared and Lydia trailed the scarred dog into the forest, with Stella limping after them. The dog led was strangely silent, and the early sun did little to ease the anxiety. Them deliberately making their way through the underbrush and trees until they came to a little space in the middle of which was the remnants of a burning fire, and the man's campsite, or what was remained of it, indicated a hurried. Jared cautiously walked up, looking around for clues with his eyes before leaving. Stumbled on a rumpled map with numerous points and red markings near the fire pit. He's planning something. Jared picked up the map and muttered, "This isn't just about Stella. He's after something bigger." Lydia indicated a surrounding group of. He must have driven off, leaving tire track behind. "Do you think we can catch him, Jared?" Perhaps his mind was racing, but we need assistance. We can't do this on our own. As if in agreement, the scarred hound barked and turned to guide them back to the cabin. Jared completed the chart and followed. His determination hardening meant that preserving Stella was no longer the only goal. As they got back to the cabin, Jared grabbed about stopping a man who obviously didn't care about the people he was endangering. His hands shaking, he called the local police and described what had happened during the previous 24 hours from the cop on the other end listened carefully to her tone of seriousness as she described the man's first attack to the finding of his campground. She reassured him to stay put and keep the dog away, saying, "We'll send a team to investigate immediately." Jared hung up and turned to Lydia and Stella, who were on their way, saying that she seems to be the key to everything. We just have to cling on while the hours pass slowly, each minute seeming endless. Jared. Lydia tried to make Stella feel at ease while he paced the cottage, his nerves strained. The scarred dog lay by the door, its eyes as close to her wounds as possible. Never leaving the tree line, Jared went outside until the distant sirens finally disturbed the stillness. He felt a wave of relief when police cars approached the dirt road. A towering stern officer appeared, surrounded by a Mr. Grant, the deputy's team, asked, holding out his hand, and Jared nodded. As the officers spread out to protect the area, "That's me, and I appreciate you coming." Jared gave the lead cop the map and explained its importance to the officers. His face darkened as he examined it. "These markings match the information we've received regarding illicit animals. This man is a member of a much larger trafficking operation in the area, Jared's. He wanted Stella, the officer, because his stomach turned into an animal trafficking operation. Grimly acknowledged that in some circles, dogs like her are rare and prized." Lydia went forward with a trembling voice, likely intending to sell her to the highest bidder. But why go to such lengths? Extremes, the officer sighed. Why not just find another dog? It's not just about. People like the dog thrive on fear and control. Thus it's about shattering the spirit of those who attempt to defend them. With rage brewing inside of him, Jared balled his fists. "Let's stop him, though. The officer put a comforting hand on his shoulder and said, "With the evidence you've given us, we have a substantial case. Just as the police got ready to follow the suspect, we might just be able to shut down his entire business with Stella's assistance." Jared knelt next to Stella and used a map and tire tracks. "How have you been? We're going to make sure that nobody ever hurts you again, Stella," he said in a whisper while petting her fur. The scarred dog barked once, as though in agreement, and she licked his palm, her eyes gleaming with appreciation and confidence. Jared observed as it trotted off to join the officers, gaining a newfound respect for the weird dog in his heart. And by the time the police convoy vanished into the woods, the sun had already risen. Jared and Lydia sat on the veranda of the cabin while the sky was glowing golden. Between them, Stella's anxiety is now starting to fade. "She's safe now," Lydia murmured in a quiet voice, and, thanks to her and to him, Jared nodded and kept his eyes focused on the horizon. Despite his fatigue, he smiled as he stared down at Stella. "You're more than just a puppy, St." As the sun began to set, Jared, Lydia, and Stella sat peacefully on the cabin's porch. The tranquility of the woodland stood in sharp contrast to the turmoil they had before experienced. After 48 hours, Stella laid her head on Jared's lap and breathed gently. Soothing rhythm that reduced the tension that was still present in the air. Jared gazed down at her while softly caressing her. He whispered softly, "You've gone through a lot, child, but you're safe now. We'll make." Lydia leaned against the railing, her eyes reflecting the warm hues of the surroundings, certain that nothing like would ever happen again. "It's amazing how courageous she is," she continued, her voice full of admiringly. "And I'm amazed at how that other dog benefited us." Jared nodded. It seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done, almost as though the lead had been delivered to us later that night. When the officer came back to the cabin to provide an update, his uniform was covered in dirt, and the signs of a long and difficult day were visible on his face. He claimed his steady but exhausted tone. "He's in custody now," and Jared exhaled a breath he hadn't, acknowledged that he was carrying a thank you, and his voice was full of sincere "thank you." The officer now provided an explanation based on the evidence we collected. "We have enough information from the campsite and the map you gave us to not only prosecute him, but also demolish Lydia's network of illicit animal smugglers is a major breakthrough." The cop nodded as Stella's eyes widened, indicating that she was a target. But because of her and you, we've made the initial move to permanently halt them," as the cop got ready to. Jared was hesitant to leave. "But what about the other dog that guided us to The officer's small smile at the campsite vanished as soon as we secured the area, as if it knew its work was done. Jared and Lydia exchanged glances. Whether it was fate or something else entirely, they both realized that the damaged dog's appearance had been nothing short of miraculous. Something inexplicable, and they were appreciative of its help in the days after. Jared and Lydia, devoted to assisting Stella in healing. Her wounds took time to heal, but her spirit stayed intact. She appeared to feel at last secure, and her mischievous side started to show. Jared would frequently catch her in her tail at the first sight of attention, which was an indication that she was starting to trust Lydia once more. Recommended contacting a nearby veterinarian for a comprehensive examination. Dr. Harper was a caring and a skilled veterinarian, liked Stella right away since she's a warrior. After assessing her, he stated that she would require some time to recover physically. Jared nodded emotionally, saying she has all the time she needs and is a member of our family. Now that word of Stella's story has circulated around the tiny hamlet, encouraging. Numerous neighborhood animal shelters and rescue groups contacted us in an attempt to. Jared and Lydia agreed to hear about her efforts to promote animal welfare, and they hoped that Stella's tenacity would, possibly, one day while Jared was cutting wood, inspire others to act against neglect and brutality. The cop who had taken her statement days earlier was in the automobile that pulled up the driveway near the cabin. Asked, wiping his hands, "What's this?" as he stepped out with a little plaque. The cop grinned on his jeans as a sign of gratitude from the. "You won't believe how many lives you and Stella saved for the police and the community." Jared took the plaque that acknowledged his bravery and made his heart fill with pride. As the weeks stretched into months, The cabin transformed into a haven of compassion for opposing injustice. Not only did her playful barks reverberate for Jared and Lydia, but also for Stella. The woodland, the sound that always made them smile. Jared frequently found himself thinking back on what had happened. He reflected one evening while sitting on the porch with Lydia and Stella by saying, "It's funny how life works. Lydia, I wouldn't have believed anyone if they had told me a year ago that a dog would make everything better. Jared, she's more than just a puppy. She's a representation of hope." Second chances. Jared and Lydia found a tiny, worn marker one day while EXP was wandering the wilderness. The words in remembrance of Scout, they were engraved on the scar dog close to the clearing where they had first seen it. Devoted guardian, Jared bent over and traced the letters with his fingertips. Scout he. Lydia touched his shoulder and muttered that must have been its name. It makes sense now. Scout was more than simply a dog. It was keeping watch over us. In every instance, they stood silently for a brief while to honor the canine that had been so crucial to. Jared replied, "Let's head back," as he looked down at Stella, who was waving her tail as though acknowledging their story. As they made their way back to the cabin, Jared's voice was full with silent appreciation, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of. Stella, the goddess of peace, galloped forth, her golden fur gleaming in the sunlight. No longer just a dog. They were her rescuers, and now they were a family, bound by bravery, tenacity, and stories like Stella's unshakable bond serve as a reminder of the strength of hope and the impact of compassion. If this trip made you think about lending a hand to a needy animal or supporting your neighborhood shelters, and remember to subscribe to our channel for more touching stories. Together, let's continue to spread kindness, one tale at a time.